Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you are listening or watching this podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver. On this podcast, it's my pleasure to lead discussions about all things Bible and theology. And I'm thrilled to have as my guest on this episode, Detective J. Warner Wallace. Detective Wallace is a well-known and influential Christian apologist, a highly sought-after lecturer and conference speaker. But before becoming a Christian apologist, he was an atheist and a cold-case homicide detective for the Los Angeles Police Department. Wallace's cases have been featured on many television programs, including NBC's Dateline, Fox News, Oxygen True Crime, True TV, and Court TV. He has also had a part in the movie God's Not Dead 2. Wallace came to faith in Christ at the age of 35 after applying the principles of cold case homicide detective work to the reliability of the gospel records. After coming to faith in Christ, Detective Wallace studied at Gateway Seminary, formerly known as Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary. He serves as an adjunct faculty member, adjunct professor of apologetics at Gateway Seminary, at Talbot School of Theology, and Southern Evangelical Seminary. Detective Wallace has written several very influential books in the realm of Christian apologetics, including, but not limited to, Forensic Faith, Person of Interest, God's Crime Scene, and the book we are discussing in today's program, Cold Case Christianity, subtitled A Homicide Detective Investigates the Claims of the Gospels. Jim, welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
I'm glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
As we were discussing before we hit the record button, I appreciate being exposed to your ministry and to your book, I think 6 or 7 years ago, at a Wilberforce weekend event there in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, Colson Center has been a great blessing to me to be able to partner with them and teach there. And so I was glad you were there.
Well, we're talking about the book, Cold Case Christianity,
right?
Subtitled, A Homicide Detective Investigates the Claims of the Gospels. And in your preface to Cold Case Christianity, you write, now I'm quoting, there are many similarities between investigating cold cases and investigating the claims of Christianity. I think that's a great place for us to start. What are some of the similarities that you that are at the heart of your book?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is that, and I get this criticism a lot from skeptics who would say, how does a cold case detective have any bearing on all in doing history? And in essence, we are kind of doing history. But if you think about it, any investigation of events that occur in a timeline, whether they're 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 50 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, all of us working cold cases are basically investigating history, the history of a crime. And so there's a lot of skills that you kind of bring into play, especially if there's a collection of what allegedly are eyewitness accounts of this event. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about, and I've talked and actually been along, I got good friends who are theologians, who are apologists as well, who are trying to kind of understand, well, why do these accounts vary in such a way? Is this going to affect their reliability? Is this, for example, just the nature of ancient accounts that maybe they took some liberty with the details? But if you've ever investigated in eyewitness accounts as a career, you'll discover this is very, very, there's never a time when they don't seem to conflict in some way. And you as a detective have to figure out why those alleged conflicts are really not contradictions at all. They are simply are separate and individual perceptions of the same event. So a lot of what we do working cold cases and interviewing and assessing the reliability of eyewitnesses does have an application if this historical event you're investigating also is allegedly based on eyewitness accounts. And so that's why I think it has some application.
That's great. And I've introduced you already about how you were an atheist till you're about 35 years old. Is that correct?
Right. That's right. Yeah.
And you applied these principles of cold case homicide detective work to the case for Christ, right?
I wasn't trying to do it to be clever. I mean, if whatever your experience may be, sometimes people will read scripture for the first time and they'll really personalize it. They'll say, gosh, this sounds like something that had happened to me. And I can understand how this might, they're just taking their approach, their personal approach to trying to assess what this is saying to them. I didn't have that kind of background. I mean, for me, it was going to be just hard, straight facts. Is this reliable? Can I trust what these folks are said 2,000 years ago? Are they even eyewitnesses to begin with? Is this all just fiction? These are the kinds of questions that you find yourself asking, whether it's a gospel author or whether it's somebody comes forward 30 years after a crime and makes some assertion about somebody they think or they're saying did this crime. You're kind of stuck in the same place. Is this all fiction? How do I test it? And if I was to test it, how would it turn out? And that was basically my curiosity. I just applied the skills that I had, especially a skill that I had developed maybe about 2 years prior to walking in that church for the first time. I have kind of become our agency's expert in forensic statement analysis. Not that we had a lot of people doing this work. There's only like 3 or 4 of us. But I can tell you that I loved it. And I immediately, when I opened the scriptures, I knew I had to take that process, that way of thinking, and apply it to the Gospels.
And of course, as you approach the Gospels, you were not coming as a friendly reader of it necessarily. You wanted the truth, but you weren't seeking to become a believer, were you?
Well, no, and I wasn't also seeking to debunk it. My friend Lee Strobel, his wife Leslie, before he wrote The Case for Christ, she became a Christian first. That didn't happen for us. We became Christians at the same time, Susie and I. So a lot of it for me was I was not trying to debunk it because my wife was interested and I wasn't. I was pretty benign about it because I just figured it was a ridiculous fiction that really, who spends a lot of time trying to debunk the Loch Ness Monster or debunk, Peter Pan, or who does that? Why would I even worry about doing that? It wasn't like I was trying to discourage Susie. I honestly was more than happy. My dad's a very committed atheist. And even now I feel like he's more than happy to go to church because he feels like it has some practical role to play with some people. So why would you mess with those people? Well, if it's good for them, great. And if it's good for your wife, go. You don't have to believe it. And that's where he stands. And I was more than happy to be the same way.
Well, excited to learn more about that and all your experiences here as you apply the cold case detective work to the gospel accounts. In chapter 2 of your book, entitled Learn How to Infer, you discuss abductive reasoning. And tell us what abductive reasoning entails for a cold case detective and how that principle applies to the historicity of the gospel records.
Well, I mean, this is what all of us do. Every one of us who is involved in trying to figure out, like, what if the facts before us lead to a certain logical conclusion. This is what parents do when their kids tell them a story. This is where I was last night. We are taking all of the evidence that we have, and then we are looking at the possible explanations for this evidence. And we are trying to figure out which of those possible explanations is the most reasonable in light of the evidence at hand. So if your son or daughter comes home and tells you a story, but doesn't seem to match up with the evidence, you're going to be questioning him a little further, right? Well, this is a skill set that most of us don't take for granted, and we use it all the time. And we ask jurors to use this skill set all the time because I'm going to offer an explanation for this evidence, and the defense might offer a different one. You're going to have to figure out what the most reasonable inference is from the evidence. Well, that's called abductive reasoning. And this is something that I used when I was trying to figure out which of the potential explanations for the resurrection, for example, was the most reasonable. Because as an atheist, I've heard people, and I also would have said, well, maybe it's just all a lie. Maybe they imagined it. Maybe they, saw a vision that they didn't actually really occur. Maybe he wasn't really dead on the cross. He just was kind of injured badly and just was resuscitated rather than resurrected. There's lots of ways to explain the data. The question is, which of the maybe he just actually arose from the grave the way the gospel authors claim. Well, which of those is the most reasonable? That's the process that we would call abductive reasoning. And we try to do this in the book because at some point, the most critical claim, the most important piece of evidence in the Christian worldview is the resurrection. If that occurred, it changes everything. This is why Paul puts that stake in the hill, when he talks about it in 1 Corinthians 15. that this is the thing that I learned and saw with my eyes, at least the risen Christ, but then learned about the resurrection from the disciples who he appeared to. This is the stuff that he can he can put the stake in the mountain for a lot of other issues. He doesn't. He puts it on the resurrection. So in the end, that's really what we're using this evidence for. We're reading the Gospels to see not what I couldn't really care less about what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount as a non-believer. I needed to know, did that resurrection occur? Because if it did, I'm going to look at the Sermon on the Mount completely differently. So it turns out that's the first domino that has to fall for every other domino to have impact.
Then he's more than just a wise sage.
That's right.
Well, in the third chapter of your book, you argue that every good detective needs to learn to, and I quote, respect the nature of circumstantial evidence. Do you like that you get quoted here?
Well, and that's something that I think is such a huge part of the work I've been doing in the last, all the years since I wrote Cold Case Christianity. And this version you're probably looking at is it's the newer version. It's the 10th anniversary version. 10 years ago, I think that still a lot of people, and even today, a lot of people don't understand what circumstantial evidence is and how to think circumstance. They think that word is such a pejorative, right? It's like, all they have is a circumstantial case, or that's purely circumstantial, as if to say this is somehow lesser. I hear all the time people will say, well, you have no hard evidence for Christianity. Well, there is no hard evidence for anything because it's not a category. There's only two forms of evidence in any case. That is direct evidence, eyewitness accounts, and indirect evidence, everything else. Now, we also call indirect evidence circumstantial evidence, but fingerprints are indirect evidence, circumstantial. DNA is circumstantial evidence. If it's not an eyewitness account, it falls in the indirect category or circumstantial category. So if we're going to make a case, just from DNA, we have no eyewitnesses, well, that's a circumstantial case. And certainly most people would not say, oh man, it's just it's all they have is DNA. Look, in the end, we have to understand the categories of evidence. Now, it turns out we've got both kinds of evidence for the Christian worldview, and understanding how they fit and how to build a cumulative circumstantial case that points to the same inference is an important role that most of us as detectives have to take care of in front of a jury. It can also help us make the case for Christianity.
And so, as you write in several of your works, circumstantial evidence is a strong case if it's, as you put it, 1,000 paper cuts, right? Death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Death by 1,000 paper cuts, yeah. And what's interesting is that then you say, well, what counts as evidence in a circumstantial case? Everything. Every little thing that you would walk by, which is why it's so fun to work cold cases, because a lot of even detectives don't understand the power of the stuff they might have walked by 30 years ago. And so we get a chance to go back and look at that and say, well, look, if I add this and 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 this, and I got 1,000 little things, well, wow, what's the best inference from all of that data? And sometimes the first investigator on the cases that I've worked maybe stopped short. He collected 8 things. Well, there was probably 80 things he could have collected if he was really thinking outside the box. And what's missing from the crime scene, for example? Most people don't think about that. But most crime scenes have stuff that's there and stuff that could be there but isn't. And the question becomes, well, why isn't this here? And so you can actually make a case from stuff that's missing, from words that weren't said, from behaviors that weren't performed or observed. So the negative is as important as the positive sometimes.
So without reasonable doubt, could you comment on that a little bit?
Well, yeah, sometimes
what that means?
One thing that'll help, I think most of your listeners or anyone who's trying to make a case for anything is to understand what is the standard of evidence. At what point is enough enough? At what point can I say, well, do I know anything beyond a possible doubt? No. We don't try cases beyond a possible doubt because you could never convict anybody. The standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. And that the reason why that standard of proof is set there is because every case has unanswered questions. I can't answer everyone's questions. And I have to ask jurors before I impanel them. Are you the kind of person who can render a verdict, even though you're going to have significant unanswered questions? It turns out you're good at this because everyone does this every day. We start our car. We have all kinds of questions about how the car operates. You put a key in your door lock. You don't know how the tumblers in the lock work, but it works every time you do it. So with all those unanswered questions, you continue to open your door. So there are just things that we don't have answers for. And every case I've ever worked in front of a jury, I told them up front, I can't answer every question. Now the distance between reasonable doubt and possible doubt as the gap of your unanswered questions. And most of us are able to render a verdict, even though we have unanswered questions. So you can get to reasonable doubt, but that's much lower than possible doubt. And so that difference is important. And I'm not trying to prove Christianity beyond a possible doubt, because that would be stupid. I can't prove anything. I can't even prove that you and I are really having this conversation beyond a possible doubt. For all I know, you're an AI-generated host, and that's going to be
pretty good
soon.
at that.
Yeah, at some point that will be a fear or a possibility. But the point I'm trying to make is that you can't prove anything beyond a possible doubt. So if you can be realistic about your standard of proof, you can go a long way to making a case.
Well, in chapter 4, you make the case that every good detective must be able to evaluate the reliability of witnesses. Would you please help us think through, like a cold case detective, as it relates to witnesses and the biblical text?
Well, let's just say one thing about that'll be helpful, I think, for people, and that's that no witnesses in any case I've ever worked have ever agreed 100%. It doesn't happen. We actually ask the dispatcher before we get called out to a scene to separate the eyewitnesses, have the officers there separate them. We don't want them sitting and talking to each other for an hour before the detectives get there. Because if they do that, they're just going to start to merge their stories. They're going to start to say, well, maybe you're right, and I saw it wrong. And then they start to kind of make all of their stories sound the same. Not because they're trying to deceive anybody, but because that's just the nature of how humans interact. And we don't want that. We want there to be significant differences between their stories, because in the end, we know those differences are not a contradiction. Even if it just happened an hour ago, are we going to deny that it happened because there are differences in the way each witness describes it? No, we're going to have to figure out, like, why are they describing it differently? Well, the same thing is true of the gospel authors. When I first read them, I realized they don't describe the scenes exactly the same way. And there are several places where you're scratching your head, like, how do I even resolve this? Is this resolvable? This is the question with every set of witnesses. And so I think it's important for us to realize that the differences in the accounts do not disqualify them. Instead, they should provoke you to investigate them.
And tomorrow, actually, I'm teaching a hybrid intensive 2 days on the Gospel of Matthew. And I bring this up, and I really quote from you as it relates to that, because as you're saying, that's we struggle with the so-called synoptic problem and how these different authors writing about the same perspective. You're saying it's not really a big issue as scholars are making it out to be.
No, it's not the synoptic problem. It shouldn't be called that. It's actually it's a virtue for us to be able to see it, because if you had, let's put it this way, if there was no problem, quote unquote, in so much that every one of these the three synoptic gospels matched word for word, you would say, why do we even have three gospels? This is all just one account that's been, as a matter of fact, usually critics will say, well, where I see there are what appear to be almost word for word copies or repeats, then they say, there's the problem. Look, this is often the case, right? Where look at what John does. Fourth gospel out. John, you can tell, my wife and I are reading the Gospel of John right now as part of our daily readings, and we're in the 5th chapter. It's so obvious that John is fully aware of the synoptics and is simply trying to fill in the details. Yet at certain places, you will see he's very similar. He's going to be very similar to other accounts, or he's certainly aware of other accounts. Well, this was the case also of eyewitnesses. If I interview you 10 years after I interview somebody else, or even just 10 weeks, and you are aware of what that first witness told me, you may very well say it the same way. You may very well say, well, yeah, just like John said, or just like Joe said, and you'll just give me the same paragraph. But you're going to add something different, some twist that's your own perception, that's your own way of seeing the scene, or what it was you preferred to focus on because of your life experience, your preferences, your desires, your interests. This is very common in eyewitness accounts. And so it's not just, so to look at what might look like a parallel and to redact it out to say it's not true, that's a false way to approach eyewitness accounts. Because you have to remember, when we have eyewitnesses, typically they see the event at the same time. Then they are interviewed in the same afternoon. And when that happens, you have much less of that kind of parallel. They haven't had a chance to talk to each other about it yet. But if you wait 4 weeks and now you interview 2 and 3, well, now you're going to hear some of number 1 in the 2 and 3, plus their own spin, their own perception. If you wait another 3 weeks and interview number 4, you're going to get some of 1, 2, and 3, and then you're going to get his or her perception added to that. That's just the way these kinds of cases work. It doesn't mean anything's false. It doesn't mean there's lies in there. You can test that. The question is, but you shouldn't kick it out either. You have to investigate every single line, and don't assume because you see a parallel or because you see as an apparent discrepancy or a contradiction. These aren't really contradictions if you work them out. But by the way, defense attorneys love to call them that in criminal trials. So don't be surprised when critics of the Gospels will point them out and say, how can you resolve this? How can you resolve that? Well, this is our burden, is to show that those are not really contradictions.
Yeah. And so what would you say if 4 individuals came to you and you're interviewing each of them and all 4 have the identical same story? What would you conclude?
Well, a couple of things. If it was in real time, if it was 2024 and I'm investigating a case and 4 people came to me and I still have access to these 4, they're out in the lobby and I'm waiting to bring them into the interview room so I can do interviews again. Well, now I get a chance to mine out, to see, well, really, is that really what you said? I can actually bring out the larger testimony by asking questions. Well, what happened? But stop, back up now, go over here. What happened over there though? And I can now when I get done, I'm going to have long transcripts of 4 statements that are very different. Because in real time, if someone tells me the same thing, it might just be that they've talked about this before they got here and they've kind of like melded their story. But really, if I ask penetrating questions, I can get to more and more detail that separates those stories. That's the problem, though, with the Gospels. I don't have access to those authors to go back and say, well, yeah, this is confusing. This happens, by the way, when I have a real case. Someone makes a statement to the patrol officer. He writes a report. I'm reading the report. I'm like, what the heck? Well, I call the witness. Can we meet tomorrow? Yeah. He comes into the station. We sit down. Okay. Tell me what happened here, because I'm not going to tell him what I saw was confusing. I'm going to let him retell it to me. And by interviewing him over and over again on this, I can see now, I can make sense of what used to be a confusing point. But I don't have access to the authors of the Gospels where I can go back and do that. And this is often the case in cold cases where you don't have access to the witnesses to go back in. So now you have to live with what appears to be confusing, but you have to figure out how it fits in the overall case.
But if you had 4 individuals that had the same identical case and they hadn't been separated out, same identical story, right, you would think that they've been working together, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah, especially if you had this in real time. I have had this happen before, where you get witnesses, you get suspects in a case, and the suspects have a story they've developed together. The first thing you do with those guys is you separate them, because whatever that 4-line story they worked on together, that's all they've memorized so far. So if you can push them to a 5th line, now they start to see conflicts. If everyone tells the same story, but when you push them, they tell different stories out of conflicts, that's different. So I think that, yes, when I see that if initially, let's put it this way, for sure, I don't think skeptics would have more confidence in the Gospels if they were each the exact same word count, the exact same page count, and the exact same content. They would assume this is a farce. So you can only have it one way or the other. And it turns out that this is the level of variation in the gospel accounts that I would expect to see between any set of witnesses describing any event, whether it was a month ago, a year ago, or a decade ago.
So I love that, as there are 4 different authors writing about the same events, the life of the person and words and works of Jesus Christ, you'd expect similarities, but you'd also expect some of those differences.
Well, and a lot of it's not just similar. It's not even just similarity. For example, I have a good friend, Frank Turek. He's an apologist. We do a lot of events together. He's heard my talks. I've heard his talks. So there are times when we come to this issue where either he liked the way that I said it, so he just says it the same way. You said tomorrow you're going to be teaching a class and you're going to probably quote. Well, at some point I just say it. Same is true for me with Frank's work. Frank says it a certain way. I'm like, that's an easier way to say it. So I just say it the way Frank says it. Now, the issue, of course, is that this is very common between witnesses. It's not that I didn't also see it or also don't have that information. It's just that the way that he said it, I like that better. It's very concise. And so I just use that verbiage. I use that phrasing to describe something that I also experienced, or I also knew to be true, or I also observed. So it's not uncommon for all of us to do that, especially, by the way, this is very different. I think that people look at the Gospels as if this event occurred and then they were witnessing or interviewing eyewitnesses. No, it turns out this event occurred and then they spent years, day after day after day, telling the same story of events, the same sequence of events, to all kinds of different people. They were on fire to preach the gospel to the known world. And they went out and did it over and over and over again. How many times do you think did Matthew tell about his experiences with Jesus? How many times over and over and over again? And if you've seen my talks or anyone's talks, now you can look at the talk I gave 12 years ago, and it's pretty much word for word what I'm talking about now. You develop patterns, you say it the same way. And my daughter, who's heard my talks over and over and over again, if you were to ask her similar questions, they're going to come out of her mouth the way she's heard me say it. So because that's the environment in which you have the Gospels being spoken in the first century, you would expect there to be a certain amount of patterns that would emerge in the way we tell the story. This has no bearing on whether or not the story is true. You got to just test it some other way. There's 4 ways to test it, which we talk about in the book. And so you have to take that 4-legged approach. But the fact that you might have someone saying it the same way, and that's another thing. If you were to take my stage presentations and turn them into words, they would sound like this book, Cold Case Christianity. A matter of fact, the book is my teaching to youth groups on this area. I taught for years this, and then Sean McDowell said, hey, you should write a book about this. And so I basically wrote down the words that I had been saying for years. Well, it turns out if you've been saying the same thing over and over and over again for years, you hold on to it pretty well. And this is what the gospel authors did. They saw it and they repeated it over and over and over again. And if it took 4 years, 5 years, 12 years before they actually wrote it down, like my stuff, it's still the same stuff I was talking about. It's just now in word form.
Very fascinating. Well, in another chapter, you answer the question, were they present? In other words, were the 4 Gospels written early enough to have been authored by true eyewitnesses? What did you conclude from applying your detective skills initially as an atheist to the 4 Gospel authors?
Well, okay, so there's 4 ways we have to test eyewitness accounts. Number 1, were you guys really there to see what you said you saw? Because people will say, I saw something, and they weren't even there. They're just trying to help out somebody they love who has been accused of something. Second is, can you be corroborated in some way? And there's many ways to corroborate, both from internally, from his internal consistency of his statement, to other exterior factors that maybe I could go check if he said something's over there and it's over there. Third is, have you changed your story over time, or have you been consistent? And fourth is, do you have a reason, a bias, a motivation to lie to me? So the first test is, were you really there? And so we have to figure out, look, if you want to lie about Jesus, it's pretty easy. You wait until everyone who knows the truth is dead, and then you can say whatever you want. And so the question is, did they wait until everyone who knew the truth was dead? Are the Gospels written so late that they can't even be written by eyewitnesses, rather, because the eyewitnesses would have been dead for a generation? That is often the claim of skeptics. I see it on our YouTube page all the time. People will say, oh, yeah, these were not even witnesses. These were written hundreds of years later. Well, there's some evidence in the Gospels that might tip us off. And the book of Acts, I think, is perhaps the best, because that's that period of history in the first century between the resurrection and ascension of Jesus and the death of Paul, right? It's that life of the apostles after Jesus ascends. And there's a lot of history of the Roman Empire that's in the book of Acts. And you can look and ask yourself why there are certain data missing. There's no death of Paul in the book of Acts. We know when that occurred. There's no death of Peter mentioned in the book of Acts. We know when that occurred. There's no death of James, the brother of John. Heck, Luke mentions the death of James, the brother of Jesus. But Luke mentions the death of James, the brother of John. He mentions that happened in 44 AD. That's on the pages of the book of Acts. But James, the brother of Jesus, who led the biggest church of Christians, that death is missing. So not only that, but the destruction of Jerusalem is missing. The siege of Jerusalem is missing. The death of Barnabas is missing. I mean, there's a lot of key things that happened in the first century that were important to the early church that are nowhere to be found on the pages of the New Testament and the book of Acts. And they would have been really great opportunities for Luke to then confirm what he had talked about in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus predicts certain things are going to happen, and then they do happen, and then Luke doesn't even mention it, because it hasn't happened yet. That is the most reasonable inference from the evidence. And if you do this, and I show in the book how you can back it up, you will come to an early dating of the Gospels. And anyone who's making an effort to say, well, no, these are late dated, well, based on what? I mean, I'm trying to base the dating on manuscript evidence and on missing elements in the story. I've talked to people who think it's dated later, but why? Why do you think it's dated later? Well, a couple of things. They don't think that they don't believe in prophecy, so they don't think that Jesus could have accurately predicted the destruction of the temple.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, it has to have been written after 70, right? Because he's including the destruction of the temple. There's no way he could predict that. Well, see, it's a bias against the supernatural that causes people to late date things. It's not like they have manuscript evidence for this. So that's, they'll say, oh, there's, I love it when people will challenge the authorship of Gospels because like authorship of Paul's letters. Well, these letters don't seem to be exactly the same use of Greek, or this is exactly the same order of words in certain sentences, that as if Paul never used a scribe, as if Paul never aged over time and changed his writing style. I mean, there are other ways to explain differences from a literary criticism perspective than there's two authors. And if you work in cold cases and you see a guy's been working a case for 15 years before he retires, if you look at his first part of his report and compare it to the last part of his report, you'll see that you'll look like you have two different detectives working the case. No, it's the same detective. It's just that he aged 15 years. He used 2 stenos and a secretary, and he taped some of it. He sat next to her and redid some of it. Sometimes she would correct his bad grammar. There's lots of reasons you can explain differences in long manuscripts or in a body of manuscripts that span a number of years. So I think there's good reason to trust that these are written early.
So you also alluded to corroboration. You rightly argue that the Bible is a claim about history. With that being said, could you, one would expect the truth claims of Scripture to be corroborated if true and negated if false. Would you elaborate further?
Well, a couple of things about this. The assumption first, when people want corroboration, it's largely, and this is good, I think we should corroborate it, but remember that corroboration is always touch point corroboration. You're never going to get a video. And I always use this illustration. If someone says, yeah, I saw him jump over the counter and threaten the teller. Well, okay, so how did he do it? He jumped over right there. He put his hand there, he jumped over, and then he yelled at her. So I can go back to the counter and I can print it, and I might find his palm print there. And that would corroborate the statement of the witness, but it will tell me nothing about what the witness says he's wearing or what the witness says he said. So that corroboration just gives me a small fraction of what really happened, but we would consider that corroboration in court. All corroboration short of a video is what we call touch point corroboration. It's going to just touch the overall claim. And so I'm looking for that kind of corroboration, especially on ancient claims, whether they're biblical or not, because I don't have video and I'm only going to be able to do touch point corroboration. In that sense, there's lots of things I could look at, right? I can look at the writings of other people in the 1st century or the early 2nd century. I could look at the archaeology of the area to see if it matches. I'll give you an example of this. If you were to try to corroborate with archaeology any of the claims of the Book of Mormon, you're going to find them woefully deficient. You won't find any corroboration. You won't be able to locate any city mentioned in the Book of Mormon. But we see a lot of this in the Bible, that is the New Testament, that is available for us to corroborate. Then you're looking at internal consistencies, right? Like, do the authors happen to truly know the small, insignificant cities in the region? Do they know the odd little marginalized names that people would have? Do they even know the most popular names that were actually used by people in that region? Because, Jews across the Roman Empire, depending on the region you were living in, different names were popular. So we want to make sure that, if you're writing from Egypt, for example, you probably wouldn't be able to guess exactly what the main characters in Jerusalem would be named. But it turns out these Bible authors knew the most popular Jewish names in Jerusalem. There's lots of ways of corroborating that. I've got a list of that in the book. And again, part of the reason why we want to corroborate is we want to test these things. Mm-hmm. But when someone says, I get this claim all the time. Well, tell me about a non-Christian who wrote about Jesus. Like, I need a gospel account, a written account from someone who's not a believer, because you can't believe these accounts. They're all Christians. They're all written by Christians. Well, that's the problem. People who saw Jesus became Christians. So what are you going to do with this? It's not because they started off with a bias. Mm-hmm. There's a guy in this book, in the New Testament, who wrote a gospel who was not anticipating the Christ. He wasn't looking for him. He wasn't a disciple of John the Baptist. He wasn't one of the brothers or friends of the fishermen. In fact, he was on the outside looking in. His name was Matthew. Well, he was first called Levi. And if you're looking for an account written by somebody who wasn't all in, but after watching it, wrote about it. Well, now, of course, he is all in because he saw it with his own eyes. That's the problem. So if you can test these 4 accounts, I don't know why we have to say, well, I'd have to have a non-Christian source in order to trust it. How about this? Test the 4 accounts that are written by Christians and understand that people who saw this, they wrote about it. And those accounts, they spent the rest of their life talking about it. And so the question is, did it really happen? Not, are they Christians now?
So I'm here in Texas, and I remind my students all the time that Texas is 31 times the size of Israel, the land of Israel today. 31 times. Israel's about the size of New Jersey, right?
Right.
And so all the things that Jesus did, the miracles performed, this would have been famous all throughout the land. And then the resurrection for 40 days of appearances. You're right. There's no lie large enough that could be told to conceal that of all.
Well, and if you think about this, this is something I wrote about in a book called Person of Interest. I would expect there to be a ripple. I would expect there to be the 4 Gospels and those claims, and then I would immediately expect to hear other people talking about them. Well, you do see that. You see that throughout the first 3 centuries before Christianity became the religion of the empire. And if you thought, well, yeah, there's a distortion when power corrupts, and so I agree, power does have the potential to corrupt. So all I wanted to know is, what is the story as it developed? Did it change over time? And what were non-Christian voices saying about Jesus in the 3 centuries before it became the religion of the empire? And if you look at those accounts, you'll see that this is exactly what you would expect if Jesus is who he said he was.
You indicate in your book that skeptics of the Bible, and I agree with you, will treat the New Testament very differently from virtually every other ancient historical document. And they will argue that the authors of the New Testament are biased, as you indicate, and therefore the writings that they produce cannot be trusted at the same level as, say, Tacitus, the Roman historian, or Josephus or Strabo. As a homicide detective, a cold case homicide detective, you know a great deal about motives and biases. Would you tell us more about how a detective evaluates these kind of things and how it informs our understanding of the potential biases or lack thereof of our New Testament authors?
Well, this is, there's only 3 reasons why anyone lies, whether it's writing an account or writing his eyewitness account. There's only 3 reasons. It's power, it's sex, and it's money. Those are the 3 reasons. And the one that is the biggest is probably the pursuit of power. It's authority, respect. And so I always will examine whoever's making the claim to see, do they have a reason? Are they benefiting in some way from either money, they're getting something for this, or from a relationship or sex? Or are they benefiting in the sense they are now becoming authoritative, or they're getting more powerful, they're leveraging it? And that's usually that third category is where people will claim that's what the gospel authors are doing. The skeptic will say that Paul, for example, was a nobody until he writes, these people were all nobodies until they became leaders of this movement. But to be honest, it's very different. I mean, think about this for a second. First of all, it's one thing to be famous, another to be infamous. And so if you're going to lead the movement that's going to get you killed, you got to think how many crazy people do we have in this group? But more importantly, Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, would be a fool to jump out of the position of power, authority, and respect he had as a Jew and jump in with this smaller group to suffer for 30 years all over the planet trying to tell this testimony, just to return to the level of power, authority, and respect he already had. And so I think that's, to me, is just a very weak explanation. And by the way, it's one thing when you say that one person is motivated by something, but we've got a group here. How big is the group is the question. We have a tendency to focus and say, well, it's 12. 12 people saw this, but that's not true. There were 120 in the upper room when they replaced Judas. So how many people? And then Paul says there were 500 who saw the risen Christ on the same day. Just clearly, we can argue about that number, how big that number is, but it's not just the 12. So what group dynamic in which everyone is motivated in the exact same way to do this, to me, it's ludicrous. And there's got to be a better explanation. Now, I'll just say this. If you were to take the New Testament and given all the manuscript evidence we have, the number of copies we have, how close they are to the actual time of the events, and none of the New Testament included a single miraculous event. In other words, every document we have is of this sweet preaching Jewish rabbi named Jesus who taught a lot of kind things. Great. There's no one in the planet, no skeptic would even exist who'd be challenging the authenticity of the New Testament. But you put in one miracle and suddenly it can't be trusted. This reveals the real motivation here. It's not because they think, well, the language changes in the Greek and this. No, it's about the existence of the supernatural.
Mhm.
Because without that, nobody would doubt the New Testament. So this is about a bias that people skeptics have. It's not about a bias against, because I just think about it realistically. There wouldn't be channels or a podcast or anyone talking about this if there wasn't a claim to the supernatural in the New Testament. It would be considered the most reliable, ancient Jesus of Nazareth, who's ever been recorded in Scripture or on papyrus or in any written document, because of the number of manuscripts we have alone. So I think, let's be honest about what the bias is. The bias is about the supernatural. Now, do they have a good reason? Did I, as an atheist, have a good reason to doubt the supernatural? Maybe. I would say that we all believe. I believed that the entire universe came into existence from nothing. A standard cosmological argument, right? It's Big Bang cosmology. That there is no space, time, or matter before the beginning of the universe. Therefore, everything in the universe, all space, time, and matter. I think the evidence does show us we don't live in a universe that's infinitely old. We live in a universe that had a beginning, so it begins from nothing. Well, that means that the cause has to be outside of space, time, and matter, and by definition, that means the cause is extranatural, supernatural. It turns out all of us believe in something supernatural, even as atheists. We also believe in something immaterial. We believe we're thinking with our immaterial minds. We believe it's more than just our brain. There's some relationship between brain and mind. We get that, but there are two different things. So you already believe in something immaterial that's supernatural. The only question is, what is it? And that's what I think opens and unlocks the door for us to open the New Testament.
Well, that's great. A few things I think really appreciate that I bring out oftentimes is exactly what you said about Galatians. That's Paul's very argument in Galatians, isn't that? His accusers are saying you're doing this to please the Gentiles. And he says, no, if I wanted to please man, I would have stayed in my tradition where I was growing in my influence as a Pharisee and such. And then, of course, the 12 disciples who I think Sean McDowell has written on the death of the
fate of the apostles,
right? Mm-hmm. Who were fearful men that become willing to die for the cause of Christ, having seen the resurrected Christ.
And Sean's very, very honest about the lack of veracity of some of those accounts. So that range of disciples, we have really good confidence in how Peter or Paul might have died, but we have less confidence in some of the other minor players, and because that kind of manuscript evidence that exists. And so he kind of grades them, and that was a good approach. I think we talked about this before he even wrote the book, and I think that was a really honest. Here's what I love, though. I'm not sure I would have focused even more on this. When you have it's clear that early on, plenty of the younger, early on, you'll see people are trying to discredit Christianity. So it seems to me that then we should see at least a couple alternative accounts of the deaths of these folks to discredit them. It's the silence on the other side that there isn't. It's not as though we're trying to figure out, well, did he live to 90 in a mansion in Italy, or did he? No, the only accounts we have point to martyrdom. And there's not even a critic who claims that they lived beyond their martyrdom. So now we might have some discrepancy about, well, exactly how did they die? But I don't see any alternatives in the ancient literature. So I think that should tell us something about the uniform kind of nature in which these folks suffered for their claim.
Well, so you can prove or give beyond a reasonable doubt about events in history and even the resurrection. And of course, Gary Habermas and others have done a great deal of work, and you cite them and allude to
we
them.
all stand on their shoulders for sure.
Yeah. And, but to then believe that Jesus Christ's death was the payment for your sin, that's a faith decision, right? So what was that in your life that got you from believing these are historical facts to say, I'm going to trust in Christ's finished work for my salvation?
Well, and that's where language is difficult, right? So it's a faith decision. I would say it this way. I would say that every case I put in front of a jury, I tell them that the evidence trail is going to point right to that guy, but it's not going to make it all the way, because I'm going to give you all this evidence trail, but it's going to stop short because I have some unanswered questions too. I don't even know how he got away with it. How did he do it? Why did he do it? He hasn't confessed to this. So I can only give you so much evidence. It's going to point right to him. It's not going to point a foot to the left or a foot to the right. It's going to point right at him, but it's going to stop short of him. And I'm going to ask you to take a step across the end of the evidence trail to what I'm calling a verdict. The same thing is true here. The evidence points right to this conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead, and that he is everything he said he was. But it's not going to get you. I have open questions still. I'm sure you do too. All of us who have investigated this evidence realize it's like every other evidential case. Every other evidential case. You walk to the end of the evidence line and you step across your unanswered questions. Here we call that a step of faith. But it's really a verdict that you're rendering on the basis of evidence. But you might argue, well, that step is kind of a step of faith in a jury trial, isn't it? Well, maybe, yeah, in the sense that you're having to make a decision without all the facts, but it's really pointed directly at that conclusion. So that step is relatively small. That's what I think is happening here. Now, all this is going to do, though, for you is give you belief that Jesus is who he said he was. That's not belief in. Now, that's the way we typically use the word faith. I put my faith in Jesus. What we really mean is trust. Do I believe that he is who he said he was? And now do I trust him to save me? That's very different. And you can get belief that by simply reading what the scriptures say about Jesus and examining them evidentially. But to get to belief in, you have to read what the scriptures say about you, not what they say about Jesus. Because if you believe what they say about Jesus, if you think they're reliable eyewitnesses, they're reliable authorities, well, then you can trust what they say about you. And what they say about us is pretty true, that we are not as great as we think we are. And that we are, if we stood in front of God, that we would be so humbled, just like Isaiah, when he might think of God, he might be talking to God, but once he gets in God's presence, it knocks him to his knees. Because you realize, wow, that gap is a lot bigger than I thought it was. I am so imperfect compared to this all-powerful, morally perfect God, that what in the world was I thinking? And when you get to that place and you realize that you can't stand in front of a holy God and that you need someone to stand in your place, you had to put your identity in somebody else because you don't want them to see me. Well, that's the move that moves you from belief that to belief in. But I wasn't going to make that move if I didn't trust these authors. So I could test the authors. Look, anyone can say anything about the theology of who we are. But Christianity is different. It makes a claim about a historical event. That's a claim you could test. How do I test the words of Buddha, the words of Baha'u'llah, the words of Confucius? You can't test them because none of those claims are grounded in history. They're just kind of like fortune cookie claims about humans. And some of them are quite wise. But this is different. This is a worldview that is rooted in a historical event. And if that actually happened, then Jesus becomes authoritative. Buddha didn't rise from the dead. Baha'u'llah died. He's been dead a long, long time. But Jesus rose from the dead. He would have a different kind of authority, including the kind of authority he has when he talks and describes who we are, what our needs are. You know, the Sermon on the Mount should compel you to realize that you cannot stand in front of a holy God. So I think in the end, that was the move but I wasn't about to make that move until I first trusted what they said about Jesus. So that's what opened the door for me to look at the writings. For example, I wasn't going to go into Romans and read Romans and for who cares? I was focused on the Gospels and the book of Acts forever because I could test that stuff. Now, once you get to Romans, now we're talking about theology. But I was already in a place of trusting the New Testament by that time. So I could trust what it said about me.
Well, that's great. Well, I am sure our listeners have found this whole conversation to be fascinating, thought-provoking, maybe even entertaining. However, that's not at all your intention, and you're not interested in simply entertaining people. In a presentation you gave that I observed online, you gave a challenge, or dare I say a bit of a rebuke. You challenged your listeners to become casemakers. You argued that it's the responsibility of every Christian, every parent, every youth leader to be training our children, our youth, our congregations to be casemakers for Christ. I think a similar call to action would be a fitting way to end today's episode. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm a Christian apologist. I was a cold case detective for my entire career, and then I kind of slipped into this because I was pastoring a church, and I became a Christian, and then I became a youth pastor, and then a pastor, and then I was writing books now. But this role of Christian apologist, I want you to think about it. You won't find it on the pages of Scripture in terms of a role within the church. There's it's a form of teaching, I suppose, but pastors and teachers, those are regular. This Christian apologist, this idea of defending what we believe, is just a duty that is given to every Christian. Yet in this generation, we seem to have taken the duty that each of us should be doing. Like, why would you pay someone to be a Christian? Then why are you buying a book from an apologist? I mean, we've created an industry that shouldn't exist because we aren't, as Christians, doing what we ought to do. If we were doing what we would ought to do, why would you wouldn't need apologetics books. This would just be the way you came to faith. It'd be the way you look at everything. You could write your own book because this is how I became a Christian. Instead, none of us become a Christian this way, and we aren't good at defending what we believe when we're supposed to be. We're called to do this. We're called to be able to give the reason for the hope that we have. Especially, that's in the context Peter is talking about when we're suffering. And trust me, those days are going to be coming. Where as a group, we're going to be suffering. Who was it? Was it might have been, I'm trying to think who it was who said that the church began in houses under persecution, and it'll probably end that way, in houses under persecution. Well, when that day comes, we're going to have to know with certainty, the kind of biblical certainty, because that word is used. I mean, the idea of having trust that you see in Scripture, hope, the word for hope, is really about certainty on the basis of information you already have. So biblical hope is really certainty. And we have to have that kind of certainty. So you should probably know if this is true. And two, we're going to have to really start to express this to others if we want them to have this kind of certainty. And we're called to do that rather than dispatch that duty to a professional, really? A professional apologist? Look, when I retired with a pension. So I get to tinker in my retirement. This is just my daily discipline. It's like a spiritual discipline. You get up and I say something about Jesus. I write something about Jesus, or podcast something about Jesus, or do a video about Jesus, or go speak about Jesus. And the reason why I'm doing that is it's like I think all of us ought to be doing that. But if everyone was doing it, there wouldn't be a need for us to do it. So I think that's what the goal should be for all of us, is to make Christian apologists extinct, because we will be doing the job that they're doing now.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate that challenge. And you, as you mentioned, you were a youth pastor after being a cold case detective, right? This is a passion of yours. And I read the work of Danny Aiken, a commentary on the book of Daniel, where he says, we're sending our children to universities like lambs to the slaughter, not preparing our children and our youth the way they need to. And of course, we're seeing that in the statistics of young people abandoning the faith.
That's right. Yeah, we are.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, for this wonderful conversation. I'm sure it's been a blessing and encouragement to many, and I hope that some will be challenged to grow in their ability to be casemakers for Christ, and certainly go and learn and gather the wonderful resources that you've made available at your website, coldcasechristianity.com.
Thanks for having me, Paul. I appreciate it.
Well, our time is up for today's episode, but we certainly haven't exhausted the contents of Detective Wallace's book. So I'd highly recommend you purchase your own copy of Cold Case Christianity, subtitled A Homicide Detective Investigates the Claims of the Gospels. It is published by David C. Cook Publishing. You can purchase it on Amazon.com. Also, make sure that you check out the many incredible resources that Detective Wallace has provided at ColdCaseChristianity.com, including a free 30-session video course to complement the book we've been discussing. Also, there are great resources for kids and tools to help you train your children to be case makers. Also, if you've benefited from today's episode, you may also benefit from our 6 to 10 minute faith-affirming findings videos. In these videos, I describe and show some of the most important discoveries from the field of biblical archaeology. They will affirm your faith in the historicity of Scripture and provide unique insights into the background and culture of the Bible. You can find them on our YouTube channel, which is also called Bible and Theology Matters. Simply go to YouTube and in the search engine type Bible and A&D Theology Matters, or go to our website, BibleandTheologyMatters.com, and click on the YouTube link. But until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.